want 3, so that helps mitigate backwards compatibility. But again, if we get up to 20 properties, this is just going to be a pain. So what's a solution to that problem, perhaps? Where you want to pass in a large or arbitrary number of arguments, but you don't want to hard code it in advance. Yeah, so a very common paradigm in Perl and in PHP and in JavaScript especially is, you know what, let's not even commit to some order because I'm never going to be happy with the right order, and then we're going to run into issues with which should be, which are required, which are optional fields, what should the order be. So you know what, I could actually say something like this: properties gets array, so that by default this argument is just an empty array, and that's fine if we do want to allow dataless student objects to exist. And actually, if we don't want that, we can instead say, you know what, this has to be an array, but it's not going to have a default value. You've got to pass me in something. And for those unfamiliar, PHP 5.3, which has started to come into vogue, actually does provide a bit of data type hinting. So PHP is still loosely typed, whereby you don't have to specify int and char and float and the like. But they're starting to provide us with features like this, where you can tell the interpreter, this is, I don't know what it's an array of, but it is an array. And by telling the interpreter array space and then variable name, it will ensure that only an array is passed in. And you can do this with objects as well, but not primitives, not int, char, float, and the like. All right, so how do you then access these fields? Well, then you would simply do something like, well, properties, quote unquote, and then properties, quote unquote, year. Voila. So in short, a whole number of directions you can go in. And frankly, the very first approach of just having public data fields, not horrible if you just need it for a simple container. But as soon as your code gets more sophisticated, as soon as you have to start making an API commitment to someone else, you better start thinking about these kinds of design decisions so you don't regret them later. So any questions on OOP, constructors, setters, getters? Because the syntax is about to change. Anything at all? Everyone knows what OOP is now. OK? No Objective-C for you. OK. Anything else? All right. So let's dive in. So this is Objective-C, and what looks familiar, right? Especially for those of you who haven't seen C for 2 or 3 years, what's familiar? What are you going to cling to now? What's argv? Yes, we've seen argv and argc. Those are back. What else? Yeah. Yeah, so something that looks like a header file. We have a slash, which we typically didn't see in something like CS50, but it does in fact exist all throughout the Linux source code and large-scale C programs. It's not include, though. It's import, which actually has different meaning, but we'll get to that. It's actually just a better version of include. Seems like we have pointers, yay. Seems like we have arrays, as suggested by the square brackets there. There's this funky notation of the @ sign and something called an auto-release pool. This was actually something that was only introduced into Objective-C by Apple this past summer. For the course, we will be using not only iOS 5, which is the latest version of the software that you might have on your own personal iOS devices, but version 4.2 or rather 4.3 of the SDK, ideally on Lion. But if you still have Snow Leopard on your own computer, it's doable. Just read the FAQs on the course's website as to what your options are. And if you have a PC, know that we've made available a dedicated computer lab in the Science Center that's usually used by the sciences, but we can use it anytime they're not holding classes or like there. Details on that are also in the FAQs. So just refer to that if need be. All right, and return 0. That looks pretty familiar. So it turns out that even though we're going to be using Xcode, which is Apple's own IDE, Integrated Development Environment, sort of Apple's version of Eclipse or NetBeans or the like, you can write Objective-C certainly at a command line using Notepad or Vim or Emacs or the like. It's really a language not all that dissimilar from C. But as soon as you want to start doing iPhone or iPad programming, well, then there's just so much in the way of libraries that Apple provides that it's just a pain to configure it all yourself at the command line or to configure a make file for yourself. And so this is why, certainly in this world, people tend to use the IDE. But for the simple case of discussion, we can actually use it at the command line. And the compiler that Xcode now uses is something called Clang. This is in many ways a better version of GCC. It actually supports many of the same command line switches that you might have used in 50 or 61, but its error messages, among other things, are typically a little more clear. You might recall fondly GCC's fairly arcane error messages. Clang's are still somewhat arcane, but there's at least more detail. And so one of the nice features about Xcode is that it leverages this Clang compiler to provide you with pretty good suggestions and yellow triangles and red X's when something's wrong with your code by pre-processing it and figuring out where you might have erred. So you'll actually find, I hope, that Xcode's actually a pretty good development environment. And in fact, it uses, for those who haven't taken something like CS153 compilers at the college, this is Clang's what's generally known as a front end to a compiler. LLVM is the back end that Apple uses. And essentially this means that Clang compiles your code, your Objective-C, into some intermediate representation, and then the back end compiler takes over from there and takes it down to zeros and ones. So realize that Clang and LLVM are the ones that you'll use by default, but GCC was used for many years by Apple and the like for Xcode. So you may see mentions of that on the internet. All right, so let's go ahead and write a very simple Objective-C program like this one here. So let me go ahead and open up not in the appliance. Let's turn this off now and largely for the rest of the term after Project 1. And let's go into a terminal window on my own Mac. And notice that I do have Clang installed because I installed Xcode on my computer. I also have GCC, which comes with Xcode as well. But for now, we'll just use Clang. And let me go ahead and create something like hello.m. Typically, in the world of Objective-C, instead of having .h and .c files, you have .h and .m files. .m generally denoting methods. Your methods go in there, and your header declarations go somewhere else. Let me go ahead and do import foundation/foundation.h. Let me go ahead and do int main int argc const char star argv. You'll see, and this is one disclaimer about Xcode, many different people seem to contribute code to the Xcode IDE. So you will see stylistic differences throughout their various templates, which I find personally annoying. You'll see a space here sometimes. You won't see a space here sometimes, as in the first part of the semester. Doesn't matter what you do so long as you are self-consistent and doing something reasonable. And so long as you don't do something like this, which some people sometimes do for God knows what reason. All right. There is one wrong way to indent your curly braces. So now let's go ahead and do @auto release pool. And let's go ahead here. Whoops. And nslog, and then we'll tease apart what these things are, and then we'll actually fire up Xcode to see things more in situ. All right. So that is exactly what we typed earlier, or what we had on the slide earlier. So let's tease apart these few parts. So at the very top, we do have something that's quite reminiscent of C. It's import, though, instead of include. And does anyone know or want to conjecture what the difference is between import and include? Yeah?
Maybe import only takes the specific things that you follow in your program.
Maybe it only takes the specific things that you call in your program. Not quite. It does actually take them all. But a good analogy here is PHP's require once function, which means that you can import the same file again and again and again in all of your various files, and you don't have to worry about doing it more than once. You're not going to get an error message from the compiler saying you already defined foo in twice just because the same file is read. Because recall from CS50, what the preprocessor in the compiler does is it will open up the file called foundation.h, copy its contents, and effectively paste them into the top of your file, as though you yourself pasted them there. For those more familiar with low-level C code or something like CS61, this include statement from years past could be used to implement this same functionality, but you would have to do something like this, like define foundation, and then you would say if ndef, if not defined, underscore foundation. So in short, there was this very hackish way with what are called macros or preprocessor directives in GCC and other compilers, where you could teach the compiler that this file's been loaded before, and you teach the compiler such by defining what's effectively a global preprocessor variable, and then subsequently always checking for it before you proceed to read the rest of the file. So this is just a long way of saying that Objective-C has made this better. So foundation slash, what's meant by the preceding word foundation slash? It's actually as simple as it looks. It's just a subdirectory, right? So somewhere on the system there is a foundation directory inside of which is a file called foundation.h. If you have a Mac or you're using the lab Macs, most of these things tend to live in /system, /libraries, /frameworks. So you can actually poke around and see these files on your own or someone else's Mac. All right, so this, let's assume, is all the same as always, where you can take in command line arguments. Auto release pool we'll come back to later today and next week. This has to do with memory management. So if you never really liked malloc, you don't have to worry about malloc anymore because it's gone mostly. But although you will see that there's actually a lot of C code throughout the iOS SDK, especially for the lowest level, highest performing things like graphics, which still do make use of C. But for the most part, most things are in Objective-C. So we'll come back to what an auto release pool is in NSLog.